Good morning, everybody. David Anderson here as your host for this first webinar from the Healthy Landscapes program. And welcome, everybody, and thank you for attending. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce the speaker. You'll notice that Ignacio's camera is on, and you have controls, and you can turn it off if you would like and just watch the presentation. The presentation itself and the audio is being recorded. We are going to turn off the recording after the presentation, so the question and answer period won't be captured for that. We're going to let Ignacio go through his full presentation without interruption. And if you have questions, you will note a chat discussion questions box, and you can type your questions or comments in there anytime you want. When the presentation is over, I will ask the questions of Ignacio. If they're ones I can answer, I will. If they're ones that Ignacio can answer, he will do so. Your mics are turned off, and we won't be turning them on. So the only way to communicate with us and with me is through the chat box right now. And I think that's just about it. At the end of the talk, just before the question and answer, Terry will post a PDF of Ignacio's talk, and you can download it, and you'll see it pop up in your little menu on the right-hand side. And with that, I'm going to introduce actually Terry McHugh, who is on the line also. Terry is with FRI Research. She's the operations manager, and she's also the program lead for the Knowledge Network. And Terry has been working very hard over the last couple of weeks to figure out which software to use and doing test runs. And she's at the helm now as the co-organizer. So thank you, Terry, and thank you to FRI Research for organizing this. And our first speaker in the series is Ignacio San Miguel. Ignacio is a PhD student with Dr. Nicholas Coops at the University of British Columbia. And he's been there for three and a half years, I think, now.
Yes, more or less.
Yeah, and closing in on the end of his PhD. He's had some very interesting research, and it was hard to pick one topic for Ignacio to give us, but this is the topic that we decided on. And with that, I'll turn the controls over to Ignacio, and away we go.
So hello, everybody. I welcome you to this session. And today I will be talking about my last piece of research, which is basically bringing all I have been doing all this time together. It's about capturing and exploring the variability of fire patterns in the boreal forest. So in the recent years, it's becoming increasingly important to understand the natural fire regimes. The natural fire regimes. So it's important to understand how much, where, how often, and why do fires burn what they do, but also the extent of applicability of these fire regime parameters. The unmanaged boreal forest in the north is a perfect place to go on and explore this variability of fire patterns and to better understand how they work. This has implications in forest management and also to better understand deviations from natural fire regimes, particularly in the views of the climate change, and also to quantify anthropogenic influence, for example, by comparing it with a benchmark of the natural fire patterns. And actually, in the last 10 years, it has become commonplace for managers or from policy in Canada to utilize these fire regime parameters to inform management decision. Such is the case, for example, of this new paradigm, which is emulating fire regimes with harvesting. So it's kind of reconciliating the two patterns that they create to create more sustainable patterns in the future. For example, moving from the smaller little levels of retention and harder and more abrupt edges to sort of bigger with more islands and more convoluted and intricated patterns that fires create in the boreal. So I forgot to mention here that governmental bodies and certification agencies have actually implemented these indexes, and they need them as core management decision-making tools. So for that, we need defendable tools and defendable methods that can produce this information so that we can inform these managers. So thanks to the availability of remote sensing data, now we know that fire is still the primary agent in the unmanaged boreal of the north. It burns some 2 million hectares yearly. Most of those fires are light in cost, and most of the area is burned by very large, infrequent fires. The fires are highly variable within and among regions, and the edges created by the perimeters are sinuous and complex. But not only what happens, in terms of the area burn is important, it's also what happens inside the fire is also very important, what we call the partial mortality or this residual vegetation. And some recent studies have actually demonstrated that they signify an important contribution in many cases, and that their amount and configuration across the landscape is important for the resilience of the boreal forest, because it will help in reassembling the system right after the fire happened. For example, it will allow the area to revegetate quickly by providing seed source into areas that were completely burned. It will also help recolonizing to some animals with little dispersal capabilities. And during the process, it will also maintain relatively high levels of connectivity across the habitat that are useful for very big mammals, such as, for example, the caribou or the moose. But in the last 10 years, we have also came to realize how difficult it is to actually go on and map these fire patterns across these vast and remote areas of the boreal forest. First and foremost, fire patterns are highly variable in response to very different drivers of fire behavior at different temporal and spatial scales. Therefore, to map these many different fires, we need to have a method that is cost-effective and repeatable to cover these large areas. Then we need also a method that allows us to move from these pixel mortality maps to delineating and creating the classes within the events and also in a consistent way. And from it, we need a set of fire metrics that will allow us to actually go on and compare how those patterns change within and among those regions. Those metrics need to be comparable across regions and relevant for management. But how much do we know so far? As I said before, we know that fires are highly variable, that in many cases they are region-specific in response to particular drivers of fire behavior, such as, weather conditions or land cover. And we have an important amount of residual vegetation. But this information is generally based in very few studies. Mostly, I'm talking about the information of whatever happens inside the fire. And these studies are only contain a very small subset of fires, generally less than 10. We'll come by that later. And this is mostly because of how costly it is to obtain field data, which has hindered the applicability of these studies to the broader expanse of the boreal forest. There are other studies that cover a much broader areas, but they don't use calibration data or ground truth data. And because we need defendable data, those are not particularly interesting for managers. And another thing that is problematic and challenging is that all those studies use a different sets of data, methods, metrics, and statistical comparisons, which make them not too comparable, and it's difficult for managers to understand major spatial patterns across the boreal forest. So why we only cover so few fires across the boreal forest in terms of this detailed information? First, we have information coming from photo interpretation, mortality maps that are highly precise and expensive. They need highly trained interpreters, which are often difficult to come by. And we also need very high resolution images captured right after the fire, which are not always available. But this information is highly accurate, and it creates spatially continuous data of mortality, for example, in this case, which is highly valuable for these studies. And a prime example for that is this large photo interpreted database of 129 fires created by Dave and others. It covers 6 classes of mortality, canopy mortality in this case, from 0, which is unburned, to 95 to 100% in red, which is completely burned. And this database has been used for many different studies. For example, it has been used to understand differences across different regions. For example, in terms of the vegetation left behind, this residual vegetation. Also, to understand deviances from natural variability, for example, of harvesting practices by utilizing these fire patterns as a benchmark. And also it has been used to understand what burns and why by comparing it to different weather and climatic drivers of ecosystem change. However, 129 fires are only a subset of what we have in the boreal forest. And this information was highly expensive, more than $1 million, which makes it very unlikely that we can apply this technique to the broader expanse of the boreal forest. On the other hand, we have satellite data that is freely available and is collected every 15 days over the same point on Earth. It has moderate resolution and is perfectly capable to mapping fire patterns. However, it requires field data for calibration. And that also has hindered the applicability of these methods to the broader expanse of the boreal forest. How those methods work is, first we need to capture pre and post-fire images, or a combination of them that we then can merge into one by using composite approaches. Then we need to subtract the post-fire to the pre-fire to obtain the amount of change. There are many different indexes that can accomplish this. And then for the areas for which we have plot severity data, we calibrate and see how well those observations from Landsat are relevant to those that we observe from the plot level severity, and then we calculate the breaks for the severity for the Landsat indexes, and finally combine some thematic burn severity maps, which are commonplace. But utilizing this field data also presents some challenges. Logistically speaking, collecting field plot data is expensive and difficult to collect in remote locations, and in some cases even impossible. This data is discrete. It doesn't have a spatial context. Therefore, to cover the highly heterogeneous landscapes of the boreal forest will require potentially many plots, which also will increase the cost of such a method. It also presents some challenges regarding the interpretability and comparability of the patterns that we obtain with those. Generally, composite burn index plot data is collected. This information is collected in a 30 by 30 meter plot, which is similar to a pixel of Landsat satellite data. And in the process is they evaluate different strata from the understory to the overstory, and also soil effects. And for each, they will give a number from 0, which is unburned, to 3, which is completely burned, and then average and put together all the numbers in a unitless value. That is the value that the CBA plot will take. So as you can see, this process is somewhat subjective and will vary with the observer. Furthermore, this information is less useful for managers because the CBI plot information is not physically measurable directly, and is also more difficult to interpret by managers and not readily incorporated into management plans. And again, we have all these studies present very disparate methods, data, classes. The way they define the perimeter is also different, the metrics that they use, and how they compare them across regions, which makes the comparison across studies difficult, and again, leaves very little context for managers to really understand those patterns across the boreal forest. So what we proposed is a cost-effective method that is also consistent and repeatable, and that will allow us to go on, map large areas, and then compare the patterns between regions. What we propose is a method that combines polygons of aerial photo interpretation to calibrate Landsat indexes, and those are cheaper and quicker to produce. They cover a much larger area, and they are spatially continuous and can be collected in remote areas. Then we are combining these cost-effective maps of mortality that we produce with the consistent spatial language proposed by Andis in 2012, which will allow us to define the perimeter in an objective way that is repeatable, and then also basically, not only the perimeter, but also define the classes within, also objectively speaking. And then we propose a set of fire metrics and a statistical analysis that can be used to compare these patterns across regions. So to come back into that, the objective of this study is to understand whether we can use such a method to generate a sufficiently large sample size of sufficient accuracy that can allow us to differentiate patterns between regions across the boreal plains ecozone in Canada. What we see below is are the different ecozones across this region, and I put under a spider plot, and each of the different lines will represent a metric. What I want to show there is that we want to see that each of those ecoregions or zones present unique fire pattern signatures as combinations of the different metrics that we are going to use. That is what we are trying to detect, and then try to understand why is that they are different. So I'm not going to go too much into the detail into this, but the polygon information that we use for calibration comes from Dave's database, the 129 fires. At the most, we can pick up 3 classes with Landsat, which are portrayed in there, only one partial mortality class. So we combined the 4 that were within. And then we also did a previous study in which we saw that the metrics that we can produce from Landsat were similar to those that we could produce from the method solely using aerial photo interpretation. I can ask more questions about that later if you are interested. So this is the overall view of the method. The idea is that for the fires for which we have both aerial photo interpretation polygons of mortality and Landsat data, we are going to use them to create a model. And the way this works is that we are going to try to utilize these Landsat variables to go on and predict the observed mortality that we saw from aerial photo interpretation. Once those Landsat predictor variables are calibrated, they can be used to go on and predict fires for which we don't have aerial photo interpretation data. That will create mortality maps, and then we are going to turn those mortality maps that are pixel-based into patches and delineate the perimeter using Dave's algorithm. Finally, we are going to calculate for each fire the 7 fire pattern metrics that we are also later going to talk more about. So again, the first step is to calibrate those Landsat indexes to the mortality levels that we observe in the aerial photo interpretation. So for that, we have on the one hand these 15 fires across the boreal plains. Well, some of them also fall in the nearby ecozones, but mostly in the boreal plains, and we have 3 classes of mortality that we discussed before. And here we can see here an example of how a fire looks like. The unburned being in green, partial mortality in yellow, and complete mortality in red. And then we also calculate these variables from Landsat. There are many different variables that we calculate and utilize for calibrating such a model, but the most important is within the box in red and also represented by change. So for calculating those, we need to capture first pre and post-fire information, and then we again subtract the post-fire to the pre-fire and calculate the amount of change. The index that for us holds most of the predictive power is the DMBR, that stands for the difference normalized burn ratio, and is commonly used in these in burn severity studies and any studies that regard fire patterns. We also utilize topography information and many other variables. So then the next step was going on and select the fires that we are going to actually go on and apply the model to. We selected fires from fire databases. Those are the requisites that we chose to select the fires. In total, we selected 507. And From each of the files of the databases, we retain the perimeter that allows us to select the right images because we already know where the files were, even though we were later going to define the perimeter again. And then we also knew the year of the fire, which allow us to decide which images are pre or post fire. We can see here an example of how a mortality map looks like for one of the files. We can see the unburned pixels, the partial mortality pixels, and the complete mortality pixels. We can also see water, which we mask after the process. Then we calculate the disturbance events. I don't want to go too much into the detail here, but the idea is that we move from the pixel mortality maps in the left to aggregating them using a direction connectivity. Then we remove the unburned areas. Partial mortality become islands, complete mortality disturbed. And based on those two classes, we delineate the burn patches, which are the thick black lines. We fill in any unburned islands within those burn patches with islands. And finally, we create these matrix remnants, which are a buffering exercise. So we do a buffer from the burn patches. We buffer out 200 meters and then in 200 meters. That serves us to amalgamate those disturbed patches and create a discrete fire event. The perimeter will basically be determined by the following classes. And then we are going to also calculate the metrics based on this patch disturbance event that we calculated. So this is how it looks in reality. Again, I'm going to go over this quickly, but we have we subtracted the post-fire to the pre-fire. We have these Landsat composites. We can see how the fire effects are standing out. Then we make the mortality maps. Then we turn them into this discrete event, and then on them we calculate metrics. The metrics are the following. They are metrics at two different scales. One are more generalist. For example, the event scale capture the size of the event and the complexity of the perimeter, and they help managers to lay out their harvesting footprint if they aim to emulate, for example, fire patterns, how big the footprint should be. Then we have this within fire event metrics. They tell us about what happens inside of the fire. They are useful for managers because they let them know about the details of what happens. And for example, the levels of retention, how dispersed should the retention be, etc., etc. We have different metrics. In this case, we have 5 metrics. 3 of them regard to islands, so the amount of islands in many different ways compared to the total event of the area. We have then the number of disturbed patches, which is the more disturbed patches, the more fragmented will be the fire. And then we have the percentage of the largest disturbed patch compared to the event area. So that will tell us if there is a dominant patch that is much bigger than any other and that, basically prevails. This is a graphic example of some of the metrics for a better comprehension. We can see what we calculated before and what we used to calculate the metrics, and here are some of the metrics. You can see the number of patches, the total amount of islands, and the total amount of remnants. That includes both the matrix and the island remnants. So after we calculated all these files, we came by a database with points for the centroid of each fire, and we had 7 fire pattern metrics for each. To understand what happens across the ecoregion and also, across the ecozone and also the more detailed ecoregions within, we create summaries using box plots. Each of these box plots represents one of the different metrics, and each of the boxes represents the summary that we did for a region. The first box represents all fires combined, and the rest, each of the ecoregions that we summarize within. I cannot go too much into the detail of in here, but I want to show you that we found high variability across the ecoregion. We found that, for example, in terms of total remnants, we have median values of 39% for all fires, so a substantial amount of residual vegetation, but it ranged from 5 to 91%. For example, for the percentage of the largest disturbed patch, how big was that big patch? We had median values of 63, so most of them had a predominant patch, but it ranged from 8 to 96. So this is just an example of how can we use this method to actually go on and quantify metrics that can then go can then be used by managers, for example, to understand the variability of patterns or to try laying out the harvesting footprints in a similar way to fire patterns. We also made some comparisons between the ecoregions. Our aim was to try to understand what I mentioned before, these unique signatures as unique combinations of the 7 fire pattern metrics that we use. For that, we use spider plots. Spider plots are, again, each of those different graphs represents a region, and in the circumference, we have the different metrics, the 7 metrics that we use. These being for example, the size, the complexity of the perimeter. I will later come more into the detail, but we can see if we look across, well, these are the values are relative comparisons for the median values of the region. So, for example, to show the usefulness of this approach, we can here look at the Slave River lowlands. I cannot see. Oops. Slave River lowlands have very big patches, very big fires that are highly convoluted. They have the highest amount of islands and also total remnants. And also the fires are very fragmented because they have a large number of patches. However, there is little predominance of the largest disturbed patch compared to any other of the regions. As opposed to that, we see the Wabasca lowland that has very small fires that have they are homogeneous. The perimeter is relatively regular and compact. They have little amount of residual vegetation in any of the 3 types. They have very limited number of disturbed patches, but the few patches that it has, one of them is predominant. It's much bigger than the others. This is also useful because it allows us to see the differences across regions quickly. With this information, we can also go on and try to test the hypothesis about drivers of ecosystem change. For example, in this case, we took as an example a comparison between the mid-boreal uplands and the Slave River lowlands because they present very contrasting drivers of ecosystem change. For example, the mid-boreal uplands is where most of the fires burn across the boreal plains ecozone. It has a higher amount of flammable fuels than does the Slave River lowlands. The trees are also taller and generally denser, more connected because there is less natural breaks, which tends to lead to more intense fires. And we expect that those more intense fires will leave less residuals and less and bigger patches because they tend to burn more homogeneously. As opposed to that, we have the patterns that we see in the Slave River lowlands. In here, we have a less amount of fuels because the forest is sparser in nature. Those fuels are less connected because we have interspersed wetlands and some areas that are actually bare land without any forested vegetation or with sparse vegetation, and more natural breaks, which we expect will lead to less intensity, at least close to those natural barriers, such as, for example, the wetlands, and that will increase the potential for residual creation and we expect will lead to more and smaller patches. We tested this utilizing 2 different statistical analyses. I don't want to go into the detail here, but the idea was to detect differences in the distributions in the median values and also in the shape of the distribution. So first, we made just some quick box plots, and we saw high variability in residual level, particularly in these 2. We saw that in general, again, the Slave River lowlands had much higher amount of residuals than the mid-boreal uplands, and in general, a higher amount of patches, and also the patches were, I cannot see it here, the patches were also smaller than they were in the mid-boreal uplands. This is the distribution of the information that we got from those areas. We can see after testing this hypothesis, we saw that the median and the shape are different for the total remnants and island remnants when we compare these 2 regions. And in fact, particularly for the island remnants, we can see how complex the distribution were as per compared to the one of the mid-boreal uplands. And we can also see that we didn't see differences in the shape of the distribution, but the median values were substantially different. So bringing this back to our prior hypothesis, indeed we found less amount of residual vegetation in both the metrics that we use for the mid-boreal uplands that we did for the slope river lowlands. The patches were also less and bigger in the case of this mid-boreal upland, which partially supports our prior hypothesis of ecosystem change. Yeah, this is just a simple hypothesis, and for a particular case that I just chose as an example, but it helps you to understand the potential of this method to try to support research studies and also management decisions. So in conclusion, I can say that our contribution to this challenge of trying to understand fire patterns across the boreal forest has been to propose this cost-effective method that actually helped unifying a growing collection of fire pattern data into comprehensive databases. In fact, no single study has, I mean, we cover an unprecedented number of fires, more than 500, which is, it has never happened before in the boreal forest in terms of capturing what happens within the fire event. This framework is also repeatable and consistent, which allow us to not only quantify the variability of the patterns in the regions, as we did before with the box plots, but also to reveal differences across regions. It's also relevant for management because it's based on mortality, which is tangible and physically measurable and can be directly translated into management decisions. And the method is also flexible because new metrics can be added or different classes to suit specific needs. And then the approach can be run again to cover as many fires as we desire. Again, I want to reinforce what I just commented before, that this is the first time that a single method is used to cover such an amount of fires across the boreal forest, and that it allows to measure and compare these fire patterns across the regions. This information, as we said before too, can be used to characterize the area of study, given several metrics that we consider of interest, and can be used to formulate and test hypotheses that they were impossible to test before because we didn't have a sufficient data sample to test those. There are some considerations to applying the method. First, we observed that the method does not perform very well, particularly under no-treat vegetation, but also when the forest is very sparse. For example, we have observed this in the Northwest Territories, which is just slightly present a similar landscape to the one that we just discussed before. We need reference data from fire databases. We need the perimeter, not for retaining the perimeter, but for trying to efficiently understand which images we need, and also a date from readily available and freely available fire databases. Also, it's important to acknowledge that the partial mortality class is broad. We cannot capture more detail with Landsat, at least not with the method that we use. You can only cover the last 30 years because that is what the Landsat Data Archive covers and allows you to access. And then to calibrate this method to a different area of study, it requires some area for the interpreted polygons of mortality. The future work that we are doing is that we are taking this information that we produce, the 507 fire with the 7 fire pattern metrics, and instead of comparing the variability across predefined zones, such for example ecozones or ecoregions, now we are trying to define our own. For that, we are using clustering analysis and trying to find these unique combinations of metrics and then trying to explain them. We are trying to explain them across different levels of generalization using environmental data. So for that, we are using daily weather data from the closest meteorological station to each fire, also monthly interpolated weather data. Well, both of those we use to calculate fire weather indexes, the ones that are commonly used by the Canadian agencies. Then we use the annual land cover data too, and the percentage of area disturbed prior to the fire. So the idea is to try to understand what clusters we can separate and in which conditions or what variables are important. in order to try to understand whether we can create regions of relatively homogeneous fire patterns across this large ecozone. So that's everything I wanted to present today. I thank you very much for your patience and attention, and I will be very happy to answer any questions from now on.